Coming up on today's show.
And I'm about pushing the boundaries, and it gets me in trouble. It really gets me in trouble. Like not pulling the party line and like believing the dominant narratives. In fact, I'm teaching people, and a lot of the coaching and stuff that I do, and then what I do working with clients is how to break the dominant narratives into pieces, and then finding what's in the gaps. Right? What are we not considering? And what are those implications in the organization?
Welcome to the Think Forward Show. I'm your host, Steve Fisher. And today we're joined by renowned futurist, Nicholas Badminton. With over 450 keynotes under his belt and a unique background that includes growing up around a slaughterhouse, Nick brings a refreshingly grounded yet visionary perspective to futurist work. From hope engineering to organizational psychology, and even the future of chocolate. We'll dive into how Nick connects these seemingly disparate dots to help leaders navigate uncertainty with optimism. So get ready to explore what it truly means to build futurist fluency in a world hungry for meaningful transformation. Welcome to episode 133, Hope Engineering with Nicholas Badminton. Nick, welcome to the show.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Steve.
So, we always kind of start, I know you from your work. You and I have just gotten to know each other a lot with your recent work on some like the hope engineering space. But your journey is really awesome, and I'd love for your people to know about how you we always talk about the accidental entry into futures. Kind of how that happened. So how did you kind of get into this space?
Yeah, so it's kind of really interesting. It's kind of quietly purposeful, but absolutely accidental in terms of being called a futurist, right? So, when I was 8 years old, my dad bought me this book called the Usborne Book for the Future, and sort of ignited my interest in technology and science fiction in the UK where I grew up. And I left the UK in 2008 to move to Canada. But when I grew up in the UK, there was lots of TV shows called like Tomorrow's World or whatever that would be looking at all future tech and really, really quite a sort of an academic or R&D based level of consideration of what comes next. So it was always there, and then science fiction and whatever. University, I did applied psychology computing. I wanted to do something that was very forward looking. I wasn't thinking about foresight or futures or anything like that, but it was always about, future proofing my career in a way, right? So what's gonna be the big things that happen in like 10, 20, 30 years? And, I thought human computer interaction, how the internet was evolving, organizational psychology, and something that people weren't really talking about, artificial intelligence, and it was like genetic algorithms, single layer neural networks, and some of that theory like way back in the day. And I sort of my final year's thesis on some sub-symbolic grammar checkers using single layer neural networks. So it was like linguistics as well. So I sort of did that and entered my career doing data and analytics, building large scale targeting databases for sort of marketing and other various spooky things as well. And I sort of ended up moving to Canada, moving into the advertising world, focusing on consumer. Around about that time, a great friend of mine moved from Berlin to Vancouver, and I hadn't seen him in a few years. But he was a designer for Nokia. And he was playing around with early versions of virtual reality and the stuff that Palmer Luckey and people were playing around with in dev kits and whatever, and literally like building VR headsets out of old ski goggles and smartphones, right? So we started playing around with that, and then I, out in the back of advertising, I was getting terribly bored of this short-range strategic thinking and kind of very sort of boring executional marketing projects. And I started building out keynotes. So I started doing keynotes. I started just at local colleges and universities in Vancouver where I was living, and doing TV and radio. And I was getting a reputation for like writing for like the Huffington Post and Forbes and the socialite, just talking about the future of humanity and technology. And then this guy I know, Boris, he introduced me to someone as a futurist at a drinks evening, and I was like, that's bizarre. And he was like, no, that's what you do, right? And sort of tongue in cheek sort of thing. And I sort of went back and I sort of looked at it a little bit more, and I was like, okay, well, whatever. I'm going to throw it onto LinkedIn. And then there's a lot of people were like, come on, like. And anyway, what was really interesting is over time, as I started, I was doing signal scanning, I was doing scenario exploration, I was running events. I ran an event called Cyborg Camp with Amber Case and my friend Karis. Ran another event called From Now. I did something called Future Camp for 3 years, and Future Camp was like an unconference. So for 2 days, people would get together and do demonstrations, have open discussions, have debates. There's some keynotes in there as well about everything from, biohacking all the way through to the future of music or whatever. And it sort of stuck over time and really focused. And my next door neighbor ran a speaker agency, funnily enough. And he said, can you talk about the future of agriculture? I'm like, sure I can. I grew up in an agricultural background. I worked in dairy farms, and my father ran a slaughterhouse. And he was like, oh, this is perfect. And so my sort of speaking career sort of kicked off. I've done 450 keynotes since then, and sort of really, really focused on building it out. And here I am today with lots of different friends and opportunities to really formalize this. And this is, I feel, a career that I've been meant for since that age of 8 years old when I got that book, The Book of the Future, because I'm stimulated, I'm interested, it's creative, it's analytical, it's right brain, left brain, it's everything. And it's the right level of interaction with clients as well.
450 keynotes. So is there any, that is quite a body of work there. It's almost like a TED Talk of keynotes. You could give a TED Talk on 450 keynotes. What have you, when you first started doing those, what were the stumbles? What was the, oh, wow, I wish I knew that. Like, that is, because a lot of people, including myself, you speak it, and that is, the lessons learned in something like that. Like, you're talking to your, kind of past self, right? It's like, or even just anybody out there as you coach, like to get to that type of level.
Yeah.
When you start, what have you learned? I mean, that's a lot of things you can learn over.
Yeah, for sure. It's kind of interesting. The last job I had before I quit full-time to be a futurist, I was running a two-sided marketplace, a gig economy, a company in North America called freelancer.com. And the CEO, Matt, had gone through the Stanford programs and whatever. He'd been featured in Pete Diamandis' Bold book and a number of different things. It was really great. It was a really great company. Matt's wicked smart. And the team were really good and driven, and we're very much about creating awareness and getting adoption of your views on this platform. Anyway, that aside, the presentation formats that he used and that we ultimately used as well, and obviously I riffed on that, were of a format that was very sort of easy to understand and kind of epic in its way. The whole sort of setting up the picture and talking about how to build it together. And I sort of built that on top of a foundation of having done a lot of speaker training and a lot of presentation training when I was management consultant, when I worked in advertising and such like. So I sort of ended up at this point of being really, really, compelling at putting together keynotes that could get people thinking. And obviously it's evolved over the last 10 or so years of professional speaking. And now, I've got really sharp sort of keynotes that are very much based on, research and signal scanning and trends and talking about scenarios and then, making them come to life with stories, right?
Do you look at the storytelling nature of it? I keep thinking of like books like Slideology that kind of also dissect, so like TED Talks or certain really effective presentations in terms of there's not just this act 1, 2, 3. There's a certain set of narrative and jumps and, almost like tension builds and
Sure.
and going them through. Have you kind of learned those kind of structures through the time that seem to work for you in your storytelling?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of different theories, the beginning, middle, and end being the simplistic thing, right? But I learned a model called the Kipper model.
Okay.
the fish head model when I was in a management consultant role. You get the hook and you say what you're going to say and the three things that matter and the proof points and the three proof points under the proof points, and then you summarize and then you sell it through. And my keynotes evolved to be something in and of its own, right? Very much around, I've got a foundational story at the beginning. So, for example, last week I worked with the World Intellectual Property Organization. So I told the story, and the story is about history and it roots itself in where we are today. So from big ideas and how they came to be, and what the effects were of those ideas and how it proves that futures thinking is really valuable. So a WIPRO, I should say, we explored the history of the Hyperloop and the bicycle. In fact, the history of the Hyperloop predates the bicycle to like 1799, to vacuum tube based railways back in the UK. I think it was George Medhurst and Isambard Kingdom Brunel. And then the bicycle was about 1830. So around
You do vacuum tube subways in the 18th century, the late 18th century.
Yeah. So I dig deep, right? And I dig.
Yeah, that's great.
The people are like, what? It's that aha moment. It's to sit up and pay attention. And then, you sort of ask the question. So hands up who rides bicycles, hands up who's been in a commercial Hyperloop. Like no one, right? Hands up who rides bicycles. There's over 1 billion bikes in the world. A lot of people have got more than one bike and discuss, right? So it's like that. When I talk about technology, I talk about Douglas Engelbart, designing the mouse and desktop publishing, hypertext linking, network computing, modems, a whole number of things, and how Xerox kind of riffed on that idea, didn't find the value of that until a young entrepreneur called Steve Jobs came in and gave them a small amount of stock to be able to use all of their ideas. Apple is a nearly $3 trillion company, and now Xerox is about $1.1 billion company.
Oh, it's still around. I was to say, the brand is it still around? That's
exactly. Anyway, like these bets and these gambles that we make on our future. So with my keynote, I sort of anchor it in that idea, and then I always start off in global megatrends. That sets the tone and really frames the dynamics of the bigger world. And typically what I found over the years, because I do focus on tech a lot, I go into, growth of data, AI, tech, and I've been talking about that for the last 15 years. So I'm jumped on the bandwagon as well. I've got some sort of various spin, but then you go into different trend areas, privacy and security, sustainability, whatever industry people are in, whether it's transportation or finance or insurance or whatever, and sort of build it up. And so out of the over 450 keynotes I've done, they've all been customized to a certain extent. And now they're modular. There's lots of different modules. I was just writing a keynote this morning for some patent lawyers, and they just want to go deep on the craziest things that are going to be coming next. So it's a very different kind of keynote. It's all about the most absolutely mind-bending, novel computing, neuromorphic computing. You get into connectomes and protein folding, a whole bunch of different stuff. So I sort of go down, and over the last sort of 10 to 15 years of doing this, I've just collected all of these signals and all of these trends. And what's nice is that, our beautiful humans' brains create these connections between everything. And I think that's the superpower of being a futurist. It's like suddenly you can connect these strange worlds that don't seem to be connected to create stories. And I always like to give an example like this. So self-driving vehicles, if they hit a certain critical mass, will mean that there'll be few, if not zero, accidents on the road. So people won't be dying. So those people won't be available to give healthy organs for organ donation. So then you'll have to grow organs in pigs, like human pig chimeras at scale by the people that grow the food for us today. And then what do you do with the bacon that's left over?
For those listening, you're not a futurist. He's describing what's called an implications wheel, where you take first, second, third order. But I love what you did is you just went instead of the traditional there's there's going to be no more accidents, or we'll have a better economy, but less pollution. You go to pigs. That's awesome. Like you go like where,
That's right.
and I think the real gift that we've been blessed with as futurists is that we, like you said, you talk about the synapses. We get
Yeah.
Our job is we get them close enough so people
Right.
can make the connection. You know, as a
Right.
lot of times it's so far apart, people just can't get there. And I think the skill set that we hone through whatever
Mm.
types of methods we use, like, you know, I'll do like design fiction pieces, you do keynotes, like we help them get close enough so that they can start to
Right.
connect with it in the mode that they learn. I think that's great. That's a great example.
But it it also comes from the fact that I'd spoken in health and wellness contexts, and I'd spoken at swine conventions, people that raised pigs for food.
That's great. Yeah.
And
I love a swine convention hires a futurist. It's just like, you know,
yeah,
great.
I don't.
That's vision right.
I'll be honest, don't love the industry of how pigs are raised. It's very strange, and it's kind of it's not it's not for the faint of heart, to be honest.
That is true. I mean, you said your father had a slaughterhouse. He
ran a slaughterhouse in England. I grew up in a 4,000 person village, and every 2 weeks they'd empty the blood tanks, and it would smell for about four miles around the village.
Wow.
Those heavy, pungent summers, you know.
Well, you know, and it's interesting. You know, you had talked about about in our conversations about organizational psychology, what the brain does. You know, I think about the what does the village think? I think about the village, like what does that do to the village? But you know, when you talk about the keynotes are a key part of your work and how you communicate. You know, you've done a lot in organizational psychology, exploring that. Like, how has that influenced how you approach like how you advise leaders, how you approach foresight? Because it's an interesting angle.
Yeah, you know, when I entered the workforce in like 96, 97, and over the first sort of 5 or 6 years, you really get attuned into how organizations worked. And then when I moved from software into like management consultancy, you sort of get this sixth sense of where to look in an organization for, you know, the best things that are going to motivate, the finding of information to motivate change. And what's really interesting is you very quickly realize that even if an organization is deeply structured, it's always at the very grassroots level where most of the impact can be felt, but most of the solutions exist as well. And as you go up the organization, there are just people looking for answers that find, you know, all of the information obfuscated by the overall bureaucracy of what's going on. So it's interesting. I mean, you know, I followed all these work trends of like, you know, the flat organization. You know, no one should be more than like 3 people away from the CEO or whatever, or, you know, holacracy, which is this idea of like independent thinking and you know, these little hubs of ideas. And there's something from Kyocera in Japan called amoeba thinking, where you've got amoebas of R&D cells that are, you know, self-governing and you know, report up operationally with profit and R&D budgets and whatever. They go off and do their things. But there's a truth about all of this, is that there has to be a simplicity to what you teach in an organization for change to happen. So one of the greatest stories that I have was I was brought into a large airline, and I was focused on business information management, and so it was about data cleansing, data management, the application of that, and, you know, the building of large analytical infrastructures and whatever. And they were hemorrhaging money. They didn't know what to do. They didn't have a handle. They just didn't know what they didn't know. And day one, I sat down with the executive, and he goes, "Okay, biggest problem we've got a development team, and we've got the test team, and they can never get things fixed quickly. And they go through 5, 6, 7, 8 rounds of changes before they fix something, or they can actually deploy something. It's just taking, you know, 10 times the amount of time that we needed to do. It's costing us a lot of money." And I sat down, and you sort of sit there and you're like, okay, let's look at the situation. It's like, okay, where is your team? Where's the development team sat? I'd like to see them. And it's like, okay, they're just in a building down the road. It's like, okay, that's fine. He goes, okay, the test team sat with them. He goes, no, they're in a different building. about 4 miles away. And I was like, okay, whilst we do this investigation, can we co-locate the teams and see what happens? And then just like,
just like they're like organizationally siloed, they're like physically siloed away from each.
and we put them in the same room, and things became like 10 times better.
Wow.
And it's interesting, and you know, it was moments like that that made me realize that we don't have to be over-engineered or smart or suddenly come up with new metrics and frameworks and stick them to the wall and say, oh, here we go. It's like the rewriting of job descriptions in a union-based organization, or putting people into the same room or whatever. And the same thing applies to sort of sitting in an organization or working with someone and mentoring them to be a futurist in residence. It's like, what's the 1 or 2 questions you can ask when you're planning a project that just helps people shift that idea of like, this is going to have implications in 5, 10 plus years. You know, how can we just implement that? And in addition, how can we then run activities that feed bigger thinking strategically from a foresight perspective? You know, signal scanning and reporting, for example, at a simplistic level, you know, identifying trends, but then doing deep scenario analysis every quarter. So you build up these programs of like the questions to ask and to apply, just so that people are starting to think a little bit outside of the range of time in which projects and programs exist, which starts gender people to think about futures work. And I always say, you know, everyone can start off in the morning looking at one particular signal and thinking about, you know, what if that was to affect your business? And doing that very simplistically at 15 minutes every day, even at lunchtime or whatever, it's going to start to really build that muscle to think about futures ahead of us.
Well, and it's also not making futures and foresight work a specific, you know, like one-time only action, like we do an activity and then we write a report and it goes on a desk, where it's got to be integrated into the organization, which, you know, kind of brings me to a lot of the work around like being a futurist in residence, helping organizations build like a competency, like where. And we've covered that kind of organizational psychology, getting the thinking process in. But what do you find is there, like, let's start with this. How do you coach them to become futurists in their own context? You talked about kind of the finding the signals, connecting the weak signals, but is there like a, you know, kind of a set, like not a set process, but a method in which you kind of like to kind of walk them through like the maturity, their kind of journey as well? Because a lot of them have to, there are sometimes the futurist team of one, right? They have to get into the culture. So how do you approach that?
Yeah, so I've been approached, and I've been really lucky over the last few years to have been approached by various organizations. But there's a couple of examples. I'll sort of, I won't name the organization specifically, but you know, big tech company approaches me in 2019. And they were looking globally at resiliency and understanding how they could look after their 150,000 plus employees, and what were going to be some of the most impactful signals and trends, and if they were going to move into certain countries and regions, what they'd have to consider. And so it was a really good project. So I worked very closely with the individual that was put on the project. And that meant we worked together. You know, we chatted a couple of times a week. We would co-author the reports. I would teach them the fundamentals and basics of how to think about signal scanning and trends identification. We would work through this together. I'm like the OG human co-pilot, right? And I think that's really important in an organization to like bring these people in. And you know, there's a couple of, in the last 3 or 4 years, a couple of people that have become incredibly good friends that have gone on to do, you know, masters in foresight courses or certifications or whatever. Because, you know, it got ingrained in their organizations. I'm also have been working with an engineering company. I think we've done like 10 projects together. And now they kind of use me as a bit of an accelerant for their thinking around signals and trends. So very...
The external advisor, the external expert to bring in to kind of help validate. That's good. Yeah.
Because I've done so much scanning work with so many different clients around the world that, you know, I bring this really weird perspective and these areas that they're not even thinking about. And we oftentimes dive into the scenarios as well. So yeah, I mean, over time, and the engineering client, I taught their executives how to write design fiction or, speculative fiction. I know the design fiction people get all funny about this.
We could have a debate on that one.
That design fiction, spec fiction isn't design fiction, so whatever. Let's move on.
Oh no, I look at it as an umbrella of things. But there's prototyping, there's design. There's a whole you could
prototyping, like
what out. Yeah.
Hey, and I love the design fiction friends, so big love to them. But like all of the things, and literally everything from like signals analysis into full strategic foresight, into storytelling, writing spec fiction stories, all the way through to just like signals and scanning projects. And you just realize, and this organization now has got that deeply integrated in their design part of their organization. So design and a great friend of mine is in there. She's doing a master's in foresight at Houston. She gets it. She really gets it. And she pushes me and I push her. It's a really great relationship as well. And then she brings other people along for the ride. But I'll be honest, Steve.
Yeah.
So many organizations do foresight projects and then just like throw it on the shelf or do a little execution and do nothing with it. Some organizations really step forward and really, adopt this idea. And I think we're just prior to this recording, we're talking about René Rohrbeck and what Rohrbeck and Kuhn did in terms of, validating that, organizations that have got vigilance, that are more futures ready, are more profitable, they've got high rates of growth, larger market capitalization. And it's like, there are organizations that really step forward. What's interesting is the large tech company that I worked with back in the day, they ended up using part of what I did and what we worked with together to inform like a multi-billion-dollar investment in Africa. And then the engineering company I worked with, it's informed very deep, policy shaping reports and new areas, new business lines that they were going into. And, it sort of really does activate. And that's what's really valuable about futures thinking. The organizations that really do step forward and do it, and commit to it and commit to like embedding it in their organization, they're all doing really well and they're all doing better than their competitors at being prepared for what comes next.
I think that you hit upon a couple key things. René's work, or just his interviews, his previous episode. His work helped me as I worked on building McKinsey's futures team with a number of other awesome people. We had to get the short. There's other thinkers. It's kind of like you see the people who are futures interested, or I would call them the true believers. Then there's the futures interested, and then there's the people who have to be. They're kind of like they have to be connected to it. They have to be convinced, and they're more short-term thinkers. They have a different set of goals, objectives, things that they're rewarded for, and things that they have to do. So how do you get them on board, right? And to your point, a lot of times it's that one-off and it goes on a shelf, but I find the pathways to it through innovation organizations, through different kinds of product work. It's not just about individually having futures as a function, which is important, but it has to be pervasive in the way people think. It has to be how they use the tools to do the different kinds of work in the organization. And you mentioned, with René's work, I talked with him how you can kind of, I think they're doing more research, and he can listen to that episode and cover with him, but they covered just kind of European. It was a very small population, but it was important as a longitudinal study. And he's like trying to expand that. And there's a lot more data around it, but it does give people more confidence. And it has to be not just the person. And I just think about other types of things people evangelize in an organization, but having that network. And, you've always emphasized making futures accessible. I think the one thing that's really been interesting, reading your book, Facing Our Futures. It was a great book. If you all haven't read it, we'll show you how to get it at the end. It's a great, great book. You talk about hope theory and the concept of like in your work. What is that? Because it's a different, because a lot of people think the future as collapse, transformation. They think of very strict archetypes. They think of radical change. Sometimes the future means like we have to do radical things, but there's an underlying message in the way you look at this. Could you I would love for you to share that with people that don't understand, that don't know about it.
Yeah. So, I mean, in Facing Our Futures is very much about, looking at positive and dystopian trajectories, right?
Yeah.
And I mentioned the word, I call myself a hope engineer at the beginning of the book, right? Page 1. And I'm actually now writing another book, which is more like deeper on the idea of hope theory, being able to combine with possibility thinking and futures thinking, positive psychology, that actually leads us to a new mindset and a state of mind when undertaking work, right? Projects, programs, initiatives, larger initiatives. And I'm trying to write something that's really light and easy and something that's sort of a kickstarter for the mind rather than being a fairly heavy sort of like, here's a really in-depth, method and framework, which is, Facing Our Futures. Definitely got a little bit more of that. And futures work can sort of disappear into its own sort of, a million kinds of cones and wheels and whatever, right? And I'm trying to.
There are many cones and wheels in our.
There are many
in our field.
And I think because I'm not academically taught with futures, I sort of trying to think about this as something very practical, even like, what are the questions that you ask yourself or whatever. But like, I started looking at hope and hope theory and Charles Snyder. And, and really it's about setting goals, looking at pathways forward and then creating agency for change. And no one's really spoken. There's very few people in the world that have even written papers about the intersection of hope theory and futures work. So I'm sort of diving into that. It's really interesting trying to decode what that means and how it can be used practically because, people think hope is quite a hokey concept, right? So yeah, it's really interesting, sort of working on that as a concept. So really, whilst I sort of formulate that, it's the idea that we're making plans, we are examining the future ahead of that, we are getting ready, we're setting the goals, we're giving agency. And there's some of these things that like modern businesses don't do. So I think it's really important to think about that. And that's sort of a book that hopefully is going to be coming out in 2026.
I'll be first to buy it there, brother. I mean, I will absolutely be. I'm right there, man. Because I keep thinking about two things come to mind, and I've mentioned this in the past. There's a study done on of fiction works around the future, around dystopian, utopian. There's kind of a 2x2.
Right.
Probably, I'm a former McKinsey consultant, probably because we love our 2x2s. But they looked at like kind of plausible, non-plausible, utopian, dystopian, and a majority of fiction was plausible but dystopian. There's like little, if any, if it is plausible in utopia. Kind of like positive in that way. There's a bunch of things that are kind of not plausible. Star Trek is in that one. Utopia, there's a few, but I think about the mindset. I've read a lot of prepper fiction, like a lot of post-apocalyptic, like there's almost like this car crash kind of thing. You almost kind of want to watch it from afar.
Right.
You want to watch the disaster. I mean, there are tough reads like The Road, there are some really hardcore books, if you read that, but it's like, there should be more hopeful things about humanity, which is kind of gets me. You talked about that, and I think there's a real opportunity for fiction writers to look upon the world as, a new morning, a type of. I think there's a need for that. I think people want that. So I think you're really touching on something, and it kind of leads me into. You talked about like human agency. When we talk about organizations. The big honking word of that Gen AI term, is it what it's doing? I see it changing the field. I see it helping the field, and I don't see it hurting the field, but I see it, giving people more, if you do the signals work right, if you do all the human work right, can you use it in that way? And I think I'm sure it comes up a lot in your talks, but it's like, does it help the hope theory? Does it help people think? I don't know. What does it do for human agency? What are your thoughts on that?
So I'm constantly reading about, some of the effects. We're 2-3 years into a lot of the generative AI stuff, sort of like people using it at scale. And, it can make you more productive. You can get more stuff done. You get it done more quickly. But you've got less critical thinking, less diversity of thought. Right.
We're listening. This is being taped, the mid February of 2025. DeepSeek is a couple weeks into scaring the heck out of everyone.
Right.
But if you look, there's a thing I posted on LinkedIn. There's like 1,300 things that DeepSeek won't talk about, like Taiwan. Right. It's like there are things like, remember, AI is written by the humans. It's taught by the humans. So what does that do?
I mean, I followed like AI for like 30 or something years, and then seeing this huge, like, oh my God, and every
an explosion. Yeah.
A great future friend of mine, Rami Nessa, he's up here in Canada. He went to do a talk a couple of weeks ago, and he was saying, his client confided in him. It was like, it's like an agent sent them 75 names of people that could talk about AI, and it was like, 95% of the people there don't have any background in doing anything beyond like using like ChatGPT, Claude, or whatever, right? And it's like there are deep considerations. I won't unpack. It's another sort of episode for us to get into the.
That's for part 2.
In terms of deep, there's something I call the sort of the 20% idea principle. 20% of our work can be easily undertaken by these generative AI platforms. And I think that it could be that, I'm stuck for some ideas, throw some concepts in, give me some directions, the 20% Kickstarter. Or I produced a ton of ideas. What am I missing? The 20%, sort of like accelerant out of what we've already done, right? So it's kind of interesting. And I've been using it to like build scenarios. And a lot of them are really not that great, and they're not that creative, and they can't connect things in really novel ways. So, we can frame it. And I think with futures work, there's lots of people out there saying, I've built a platform that supercharges your future scenarios. So it's like, yeah, but people end up with really average, like non-dynamic, restrictive ideas of scenarios of what comes next, because it's based on this limited thinking that exists within an LLM, right? Whereas this conversation earlier on, the conversation about, from self-driving cars to eating human pig chimera bacon. Yeah.
Connection between weak signals. I mean, that is that, right?
Yeah.
An AI can't make that leap.
Yeah, exactly.
Do that as humans, right? That's
the weak signals. It hasn't been written, right? The second order effects haven't been written. Every
algorithm. There's no algorithm for that.
The LLM is a mirror, and that's okay. But it's not a creative platform for change. Now, there's a ton of people that will be out there saying I'm wrong or whatever. It's like, show me something that's truly unique in terms of the way that something thinks versus something that can just produce something that can get a tick in the box and we can carry on with our daily work, right? And I'm about pushing the boundaries, and it gets me in trouble. It really gets me in trouble. Like not pulling the party line and like believing the dominant narratives. In fact, I'm teaching people, and a lot of the coaching and stuff that I do, and then what I do working with clients is how to break the dominant narratives into pieces, and then finding what's in the gaps. Right? What are we not considering? And what are those implications in the organization?
Well, you also talk about the implications of with AI when you talk about weak signals and the connections of them.
Yeah,
I think about here's where it can be useful. There's an interview we did a number of episodes ago with Christian Morath, who runs Itonics, and we talked a lot about the innovation process using, he's got one of those kinds of platforms that does that, and Paulo's got Orion. They're trying to do, but it's like, if he's a PhD in AI, and he's looking at it from what is human, what is AI? Like, what can we use? Like, where are the parts that require all the brain versus some help. Like the front end of like defining the project, getting the things together. Then because a lot of signals research, if you can ask it to scrape and pull the things, it can do a lot of that and it can find things, but you still have to synthesize. And I think that's where we get into, like, to your point, like if it's scenarios are scenarios, but if it doesn't have enough to it, then it's just going to give you what you put into it. And that's, again, it's not enough. I keep thinking back to Jim Dater's, one of his tenets of, if it's not crazy enough, you're not actually doing your job. Like if it's not really like far-fetched. I also think of Arthur C. Clarke. It's like, science, that something that is far more advanced to a civilization looks like magic. Right. Like if we took a television back 200 years ago, they would think it was some like witchcraft, right?
Right.
It's just, so if we're not thinking that's what we do, that's what they look for us. But some people may reject it, but at the same time, the provocation, it's the point of it. And, I want to kind of switch to some fun things as well, because you've done a lot of different projects.
Right.
One of them that I love, and I know you could talk about as much as you'd like to, but the future of chocolate, like those are the kind of things like people are like, wow, the future of chocolate. Well, no, I think about, what I think comes to my mind immediately, 3D printers, 3D printing chocolate, right?
Yeah.
Where do you source? Because we made chocolate. My wife and I we were in Peru and we did like a workshop where we actually made our own chocolate from the bean and all that. So you get to learn where it's sourced. So there's ethical sourcing, sustainability. There's, cool technology, like things you could never make. I remember watching the Netflix show, that guy who is French and he does this amazing like sculptures with chocolate. But it's like, what was how did it come about? Like, anything it uncovered for you? Like, what was like, oh my gosh, this is like wild, right? What?
So it's interesting. I can't share specifics of exactly what I found out, but it wasn't about like, it wasn't about the creation of product. And this is what I remind people. It's not about like a tangible thing. It's a lot more around the principles and the operations, about the sustainability and the accountability behind the entire industry. So you'd go into like, was it Ghana is probably not going to be able to grow cacao by 2050 to 2080, right? So because of climate. It's up. So where do you get chocolate? Where do you grow it? What do you do? Do you consider other methods of cellular production of cocoa? Do you consider, like the price and the dynamics on the market, what chocolate is as a cultural artifact? I mean, if you go back and look at the Second World War, chocolate in England was like gold, right?
Guys had their chocolate bars when they would go to Europe to give it to the kids. I mean, that was...
but it was like, people didn't have it, right? So, I mean, there's a lot of elements. It's like, how does the global community work? What does it mean when we've got such a shortage that all of the big players have to play together and they have to work together to create something that's sustainable, and, they can share the technologies and the ideas. So that was it. It was a much bigger exercise in understanding the changes in the dynamics of the industry as a whole, versus like how to 3D print a chocolate. In fact, we never in that project looked at 3D printing of chocolates and whatever, because it wasn't of any interest, because as a signal, it was something that had already been worked through and wasn't particularly interesting in the scheme of things. It gets interesting if you 3D print a chocolate and you build that from, cellular protein and cellular production of the base goods and whatever, and then you upscale operational facilities, yada yada yada, right? Precision fermentation and a number of other things. So I mean, that's I always approach projects by asking the questions like, what is the ecosystem? What are the cultural effects? What are the organizational operational effects of change coming? What are the signals that feed into that? And when you take like 3 to 5 signals and you put them through the sausage machine and start asking, operationally, ethically, from a policy perspective, from a partnership in an industry and a market perspective, what happens. That's really good futures work. And I think that's, the modeling that we have to do, rather than like, imagine a world where all of our forks are made out of chocolate so that when we finish eating using the fork, we can eat the fork, which is cool as well. Which is cool as well, and is a part of futures work and speculative products and whatever. But it's not exactly, the big value for organizations are, how does this change our strategic perspective on the world, and how do we make better decisions today to prepare for what's coming? Because change is coming, right? I always say that change is inevitable. You either change or change happens to you. And I remind that of my clients every time that I sit down with them. And interestingly, I just did a project on global naval operations and the Arctic. And
That's big.
And it's everything from the ecological environment aspect, the outdated military or naval aspect, the new technologies and new players that are coming in, the dynamics of workforce and aging and training and, location and military partnerships. And it's like, this is what we do. And I think that, what does a futurist do? And people think that we just like come up with crazy ideas of like, laser guns and, cars and stuff. And it's not. It's like, we're practical. We're practical. We do the work, right?
Yeah, and I've always, when I explain to people like where a futurist kind of lives, is you think of traditional, like, not even tech organizations, but just organizations in general. You have product, you have innovation, and you have kind of the strategy, the futures. And I look at product is dealing with 12 to 18 months. They're dealing with but they needed this. All of them need this in different ways. Right. Innovation is looking at 3 years out because they have to manage. Most people, you think of innovation, to your point, I dealt with a lot of innovation, or I built a lot of innovation organizations, and everyone thinks you're just making fun things in the back room, and it's like, no, you're actually managing a portfolio, like you're managing a startup, like you're a VC. You've got to make bets, you've got to make investments, and they make it through or they don't. Just like, when you're coming up with, just from the idea, not everything goes through. And it's like same thing with futures. There's an information level. You can do traditional strategy, traditional quote unquote, but that's a lot of forecasting work. It's a lot of, I would say, narrow band, narrow term, near term types of work and strategies, where futurists can inform the strategy function and go more than 3, 10, 20, whatever the rate of change is, right? And then it's like, I can do those types of exercises in my innovation work. And I can also do it for the prioritization of my products.
Right.
And I think to your point is doing new venture creation, new business models. Yeah. Futures work is to provoke the mind to think differently, but it also is there to inform those who are doing the work to help them stay competitive, stay ahead, but with reasonable navigate the uncertainty of the future. And I think I find that when you see it kind of trickle in and people's like the light bulbs go off and they see the value in that's for me rewarding. What is the most rewarding parts for you? Like, what kind of gives you those smile on your face as you're working with clients? You're like, oh yes, like they got it. Or what is it for you that gives you the?
I mean, when you give presentations, keynotes, and a lot of work you do online and whatever, you see these people and there's something. It's just like something has clicked. And when something clicks and it takes us down a route that they've never explored before, and they end up with something that's a level of signals and trends and insights. When we look at like the positive challenging effects or whatever, and they've got this, and it's like, oh, we need to take this more seriously. We need to consider this more importantly in the scheme of things. I mean, you talked about portfolios and innovation being 3 years. Like, I did work with this big tech company, which was like applying future thinking to your portfolio. If you look at 100 initiatives, are they going to have a place in the futures that we've explored? And you can tick it. It's like, yes, 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 no, that's going to be outdated. It's like, okay, if that's going to be outdated, what needs to come next? What can we put in place today? And it's like, oh, and then you're suddenly backcasting. And then backcasting, that's a really important part of what you do, right? So I think that that's really important. So the backcasting element, where you go from, in 20 years' time, back 10 years, back 5 years, back 3 years, and then you can basically start to see the leaps that are needed and the gaps. Where don't we have the technology, or where do we have the technology that is in early stages of being development? I was literally going down this route of neuromorphic biological computing earlier today. I was doing some research for a keynote, and then you look at DNA as a storage device, and then you look, and then you like, and then it's like, crikey, you're like, the world is the Matrix, right? And it's like, but then it's interesting to think about all of these things, right? And where we're going to stumble and where we're going to be able to go forward. In fact, for facing our futures, there's an entire it's the lost chapter. I think it's actually on futurist.com. And it was a story about a girl called Jocasta who became implicated in a backstreet deal for data, where her body was the storage device.
Oh, nice.
My publisher didn't like it in the middle of sort of a nonfiction book. Anyway, whatever. And it's kind of interesting when we start to do these things and start to play and see how clients start to draw the lines as well. And oftentimes, I'll be honest, Steve, there's a lot of clients that are so stuck in their quarterly targets or yearly targets that they get enthused briefly and then they just go back to their work. And I mean, this is what's happened in Silicon Valley or whatever. Basically, all of the companies have canceled their big futures projects. Yeah. It's all about profit. It's all about how many people we can lay off this month to hit our profit targets. It's crazy.
I wonder if, you had mentioned, I want to come back to a few things, especially futurist.com, but you mentioned Future Camp, and you and I both are know Amber well, and she's wonderful, and she hopes we're gonna give her a shout out so she listen. But I love Amber. I met Amber. She came to Gnomedex as a grad student, as a cyborg anthropology. It was just great. It was just the humans. It was just, she was just so left of center, which is what I just love so much. And I do wonder if there's room again for doing those types of events. I think people are sufficiently wondering what the future, like the uncertainty, because I think of COVID and the work I did during that with organizations to kind of rethink processes, rethink systems because of a pandemic or just something that completely throws it up to center. I do wonder if that is something that, how we can bring the community together, but I don't know. I mean, do you think there's room for that again?
I ran an event called Dark Futures for 6 years. Eventually, it was in Toronto, Vancouver, San Francisco. JP Morgan gave me their event space in San Francisco to run. I was going to do it in New York. I had a really cool, and it was the idea that you could have like 5 talks, 15 minutes to talk about the hidden systems and the dark futures. And now the world, it's like the world's been turned up to a volume of 15, and everything in sharp relief, and you can see all the badness and the goodness, and everyone's out of the shadows, and so the event's kind of dead. And it's like, you talked about Gnomedex, and there was like Bar Camp, and I based Future Camp based on, and it's like, could you build these underground, interesting, edgy counterculture festivals? It's almost like there is no counterculture anymore, because people are okay with weirdness out in the open. But it's not really weirdness, it's just normality. It's like, really framed in a completely different way, right? And, I used to go to XOXO Fest down in Portland, and it's like, it was wild.
Go to South by when it was font geeks and web designers in 2004. Yeah. It was like 2,500 of your closest web nerd friends, and now it's like, well, it's a completely different world. But I've been going, and I went 2 years ago, and even that event itself, I think it's also generational, because I think I'm a big Strauss and Howe person. Like generational, if you look at generational theory, look at the period. I mean, the 2005, 2006, like pod camp, bar camp, all those were millennials at a certain age,
Yeah,
when they're community driven, they're peer driven. The generation of that age now is not that. They're much more conservative. They're much more, I think,
that's right.
they've been through so much with COVID, with so much systemic change, especially here in the States or across Europe, and just in the Western. And I know there's a lot of listeners in other parts, and there's been a lot of change all over the world. So I
Yeah,
think, to your point, there's maybe a different kind that should be there, different kind. But I maybe its time has passed. Maybe it cyclically will come
yeah,
again. I don't know, but um,
yeah. It was the Gen Xers that build these events, right? And I think
oh yeah,
that's really
I'm of that gener. I'm a Gen X. Yeah.
and so I don't want to get too Gen Xers are better than millennials. Gen Xers were just
Or of just motivation, right? Gen X's are
yeah,
nomads, right? We're kind of fixer. There's a different set of motivations, a different set of upbringing. Yeah, no, there's no us versus them. It was more of the timing of it and the generational era, or the era of the ages of people. That's all. Yeah. I get you.
yeah, indeed. So I miss it, and COVID shot it all dead, like. And because it was such an alternative crew of people, and people are allowed to be like, immune deficient or worried about infection or like, I'm an extroverted introvert. I just want to be left alone. I'm going to go for a nap after this talk.
Get all that energy out, brother. Just get it all out and go for a nap.
Yeah. So this is kind of how it is, right? Like we don't necessarily want to get out, and COVID sort of killed that spirit somewhat. Um, I mean, it's like South by Southwest. Is Bruce Sterling even involved anymore? Right? And it's like, but Bruce Sterling's end addresses were like it. But you've got people like Douglas Rushkoff that are going to be there this year and whatever. Maybe they give the mantle to him. In fact, they should, because Douglas Rushkoff is awesome. And if the listeners have never read anything by Douglas Rushkoff, go and listen to Team Human, his podcast, and read his book called Siberia: Life in the Trenches of Hyperspace from like 1994. It's a real the beginning. It was like DMT and VR, Terence McKenna, Jerome Lanier, the early doors of the internet and hackers. Pure mathematicians are going to change the world. It's a beautiful thing.
Yeah, I do. Yeah, no, and I know we're we're kind of on time for the show, and I know we'll have a part two, definitely. But I think as we kind of get some seeing positive things, like what continues to inspire you? Like what are those that you push a lot of boundaries? You kind of, futurist.com, Glenn Heimstra, you kind of, you've been a steward in that. You've kind of taken that on as this mantle. There's so much body of work there, and it's like, you look back at that, like what continues to inspire you, and like, what does that mean for you?
Looking at the edges and looking at the people doing the work without any praise and without any recognition, with very little funding, that's really pushing forward thinking in whole new ways. Still looking for the people in the counterculture. That excites me. It does excite me. I mean, I travel around and, I'm in rooms with like associations and organizations, and it really excites me to meet people that come up to me afterwards and like have conversations about what they've done. I mean, I did a keynote on the future of agriculture, and this 80-year-old woman came up to me, this large smartphone. She was like 80 or something like that. And she goes, look, I can control, I've got internet things and controllers on my grain feeder. And she was showing me how she controls it. And it's like, it makes you realize that the world's a lot closer than maybe we're led to think, that more people are actually sort of on the same sort of trajectory of understanding what comes next and how important that is. You still got a lot of people that are knuckle draggers that are like sort of laugh and like, we just want to, just cause chaos and whatever. But I think that's a minority. So when I travel around and I meet people are stoked. When I did the UN WIPRO keynote, WIPO keynote, it was my last slide was a picture drawn by an Indian kid on the future of transportation. And he'd imagined like that there would be T-Rexes that you would ride and control with your brain.
That
It's pure
right
play,
there. That's awesome.
right? It's pure play future, right? And that makes me excited. And everyone in the room was smiling, and it's like, that's what we want. And I sent it to my kid who's 4.5, and he was like, whoa. It's like, this is it. This is what we do. It's like, and we can talk about working with kids to do futures work as well, because that's really important.
Yeah, I mean the teaching children. I mean, the futurist fluency is not just the adults. I mean, there's always two courses I think that should be taught in high school: futurist thinking and personal finance. How to budget and pay the real world, how much the real world costs, and paying off your dealing with all that. But
that's right.
But also thinking about a better world.
Yeah,
right.
Completely true.
I mean, I've worked with the Teach the Future organization, and that is one of the most important organizations in our space. Let's talk about that. And teaching kids, like, do you ever have a chance to teach kids the future? Do you ever have the chance, or what do you think about that?
I did when I was living in Vancouver. I used to go and do lectures a lot. I've done a little bit in Toronto as well. Going to universities, people in their like late teens, early 20s, and that's still a good age to chat to people about. Have I gone into schools to do it? I did about this time last year. I was in a school situation where kids were like 15 to 18, and that was really interesting. The kids are like almost shocked, but it was almost like a permission for them to really think differently about how the world works, right? So I do get an opportunity, but not as often as I'd like to do.
Yeah, schools have a tendency to teach to the middle, so and kind of pushes out the real edge thinking. So I think having that kind of space to do that is wonderful.
It's why school didn't work. It's why school didn't work for me, Steve. But as soon as I got to university,
yeah, no, same for me. It was always what I want to do. So I think I always like to kind of wrap with the legacy question. I think we're both dads. We both have young kids. It's like, when you think about the body of your work and you're thinking about looking back, like what impact do you hope it has? Like, when you look back at a life well lived? What do you?
I want to have I want to influence people that change the world, like a very big level, like being in Geneva in rooms full of people, the director general. And I did a pre-record for a keynote for the UN European Commission, and it was all about transportation. That every minister from every country around Europe and beyond is in a room talking about it, like having that level of impact. That's what I want. Making big structural investments of multi-billion dollars in places of change. I sort of I'm part of a speakers network, and there was like, what's your 10-year plan? And you'd see everyone else would be, I'd like to earn this much money. And my 10-year plan is to get an invite to speak at the Bilderberg convention, which is you're in a room. Yeah, you're in a room with every Western leader in a Chatham House scenario, and there are things that are shared and discussed and worked through together that fundamentally changes how the world works structurally, culturally, societally, economically, technologically. That's it. I'm in the game for I'm in the game for the big fish, right? And I love everything else as well, but like I'm here for that. That's why I'm here. That's why I was in Geneva last week. That's why I'll continue to travel, and I'll go to meetings and speak to interesting people that others may not want to speak to, right? Because these are the people that have got the power to change the world, right?
Absolutely. Yeah, this has been a great conversation. So people want to find you, which is there's few good places.
I type the word futurist in the internet, and I am there on page 1 because I bought futurist.com. So you can type in Nick Badminton. I'm all over the internet, all over YouTube, whatever. But yeah, you can
NIK, not
MKOLIS. You can do Nicholas at futurist.com. Contact me through that website. LinkedIn, I'm incredibly busy on LinkedIn. It's always been a good platform for discussion. Let's hope it continues to be that way. And yeah, I'm easy to find. Like, reach out. Let's work together.
That's great. Nick, thanks for being on the show. We're definitely going to have a part 2. Thanks a lot.
Yes, Dave. Take care. Bye-bye.
Thanks for listening to the Think Forward podcast. You can find us on all the major podcast platforms and at www.thinkforwardshow.com, as well as on YouTube under Think Forward Show. See you next time.